An unforgettable encounter that changed everything. What if a routine traffic stop wasn't just about a broken rule, but about power, bias, and accountability? What if the officer pulling you over wasn't just checking your license, but testing the limits of his authority? For Jordan Mitchell, that night was supposed to be like any other. A long day at work, a drive home through the city, nothing out of the ordinary. But when Officer Nathan Blake's flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror, everything changed. What started as a simple stop quickly escalated into something more sinister: unwarranted suspicion, an aggressive search, an abuse of power. Blake thought he had the upper hand. He thought he was in control. Until Jordan revealed the truth. In that single moment, the balance of power shifted. The officer who thought he held all the cards was suddenly faced with a truth he never saw coming. The man he was trying to intimidate wasn't just another driver. He was the head of internal affairs. But this story isn't just about one officer. It's about a broken system, about the fight for justice, about the courage to stand up when it matters most. If you believe in truth, accountability, and real change, this is a story you can't afford to miss. Subscribe now and join us as we uncover the moments that challenge us, inspire us, and push us to demand more from those in power. Together, we can start the conversations that lead to real change. As the sun dipped below the skyline of Chicago, casting long amber streaks across the buildings, Jordan Mitchell exhaled deeply. It had been an exhausting day at the office, and he was eager to get home, loosen his tie, and unwind. The low hum of his black sedan filled the air as he navigated the city streets, the faint sound of jazz playing in the background. His mind drifted between thoughts of an upcoming meeting and the mental relief of finally getting home. The traffic was light, and as he approached an intersection, the light turned yellow. He slowed down, watching as it flicked to red just as he reached the line. Before he could process anything else, the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. A sharp, commanding siren followed, slicing through the relative quiet of the evening. Jordan frowned slightly but remained calm as he signaled and pulled over to the curb. He had done nothing wrong, at least, nothing that warranted police intervention. He rolled down his window just as the police cruiser behind him came to a stop. Officer Nathan Blake ***, a stocky man in his late 30s, stepped out of the car, his badge glinting under the streetlights. With a buzzed haircut, squared shoulders, and an air of rigid authority, he adjusted his duty belt and made his way toward Jordan's vehicle, his steps deliberate, his presence radiating control. "License and registration," Blake ordered, his tone clipped, authoritative, but lacking any warmth. Jordan complied smoothly, reaching into his glove compartment and retrieving the requested documents. His movements were slow and deliberate, the way he'd learned to act in moments like these, unprovoking, precise, controlled. Blake took the documents and glanced over them, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You know why I pulled you over?" Jordan met his gaze through the open window, his expression neutral. "Not entirely, officer," he said evenly. "I believe I slowed down before the light turned red." Blake let out a slow breath, as if annoyed by the response. "Didn't look like a full stop to me," he said. There was a flicker of hesitation in his voice, like even he wasn't sure whether that was the real reason. He lingered, his gaze lingering a little too long on Jordan, scrutinizing every detail, the pressed navy blue suit, the polished leather watch, the quiet confidence. "You're not from around here, are you?" Blake asked, his voice taking on a different edge. Jordan hesitated for just a second before answering. "I moved here recently. The address on my license is current." Blake's expression remained unreadable, but his body language shifted ever so slightly. He leaned closer to the window, his fingers tapping against Jordan's documents as if deliberating something. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" Jordan's brow twitched just slightly, but he kept his tone steady. "Just going home, officer." Blake didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step back, folding Jordan's documents with exaggerated slowness before tucking them into his chest pocket. He straightened up, his stance shifting into something almost smug, something certain. "Step out of the car for me," Blake ordered. Jordan's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly. He had dealt with situations like this before. Still, he kept his face unreadable. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" he asked, his voice measured. Blake's expression barely shifted, but there was something in his eyes, something like amusement. "I asked you to step out of the car," he repeated. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." Jordan knew the unspoken threat in those words. He inhaled slowly before pushing open the door. As he stepped out, Blake's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up, as if searching for something, anything, to justify what he was already determined to do. "Hands where I can see them," Blake instructed, motioning toward the front of the car. Jordan complied. "You're looking for something specific?" Jordan asked, his voice still calm, but now edged with quiet challenge. Blake smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had incidents around here. Can never be too careful." Jordan turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Blake. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed like a punch. For a fraction of a second, Blake faltered. His hand twitched near his belt. "Watch your tone," Blake warned, his voice hardening. "I'm just asking a question," Jordan replied, unfazed. Blake exhaled sharply. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," he commanded. Joe Rudan let the silence stretch, then obeyed. The officer's hands moved roughly, patting him down longer than necessary. This wasn't about safety, it was about power. Jordan remained still, refusing to react, refusing to give Blake the satisfaction of discomfort. "You're clean," Blake muttered, almost as if it irritated him to admit it. "Of course, I am," Jordan replied evenly. Blake stiffened, as if the answer grated on him. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do," he muttered. "Care to explain why?" Jordan turned to face him. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said smoothly. Blake's eyes narrowed. "You a lawyer or something?" Jordan smiled faintly. "Or something." The answer irritated Blake even more. His posture tensed, his voice dropping to a near growl. "You think you're smarter than me?" Jordan's expression didn't change. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness." Blake scoffed, but his frustration was showing. "People like you always," he stopped abruptly. The words hung in the air like smoke, unfinished but undeniable. Jordan didn't move, but his voice was razor-sharp now. "People like me," he repeated. Blake looked away for the first time. "You know what I mean," Blake muttered. "I think I do," Jordan said softly, his voice more dangerous in its calm than any raised tone could have been. "And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Blake opened his mouth but closed it again. Jordan reached into his pocket, slow, deliberate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said, watching Blake stiffen. Then, he flipped open his wallet. A gleaming gold badge stared back at Blake. "Jordan Mitchell," he said, his voice almost casual. "Head of Internal Affairs for the Chicago Police Department." Blake froze, his confidence shattering in real time. His face paled. "You assumed I wouldn't know my rights," Jordan said, his voice even. "You assumed I wouldn't understand the laws you swore to uphold." Blake swallowed hard. "Return my documents," Jordan instructed. "And consider this conversation unfinished." As Jordan drove away, Blake stood frozen in the fading light, realizing that his career had just taken an irreversible turn. Jordan Mitchell drove home in silence, but his mind was far from quiet. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight. This wasn't just about Nathan Blake. It was about every officer like him, officers who let their biases dictate their actions, officers who felt untouchable because no one held them accountable. But that was about to change. The next morning, Jordan sat in his office at the Chicago Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, staring at Nathan Blake's personnel file. His record wasn't spotless. Complaints of unprofessional conduct. Reports of excessive stops. Misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Jordan knew this was bigger than Blake, it was a symptom of a deeper problem. And he wasn't interested in just a slap on the wrist. A sharp knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Linda Carter, his assistant, stepped inside, holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell. I've got last month's misconduct case summaries. Also, Chief Parker wanted me to remind you about next week's department review." Jordan nodded, taking the files from her. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Parker for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in Jordan's voice. "Of course," she said before slipping out. Jordan flipped open Blake's file again, but his focus wasn't just on one officer. It was on the culture that allowed men like Blake to operate unchecked. If Blake had felt emboldened enough to act that way toward him, a man in a tailored suit, a senior official in the police force, what did he do to those without power? How many people had walked away from encounters with him humiliated, afraid, or worse, unable to fight back? That afternoon, Jordan sat across from Chief Samuel Parker, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. The chief exhaled slowly as Jordan recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Jordan said, voice calm but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Blake's behavior isn't an isolated incident, it's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Chief Parker rubbed his temples. "This isn't the first time Blake's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally. Quietly. And that's the problem," Jordan countered. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening." He leaned forward. "It's time to be loud." Parker sighed, studying Jordan. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Jordan said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Parker frowned. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." "Good," Jordan said simply. "It's about time someone did." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Meetings. Interviews. Data analysis. Public forums where citizens voiced their experiences. Jordan worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, compiling reports, building a case not just against Blake but against a system that had let him thrive. Blake was summoned to an internal disciplinary hearing. The room was stark, cold, clinical, the kind of place where careers were either salvaged or ended. Jordan sat across from Blake, watching as the officer fidgeted in his seat, his once overbearing confidence now replaced with something closer to unease. Blake tried to defend himself. "I was just doing my job," he argued. "Traffic stops are unpredictable. I have to be cautious." Jordan let him talk. Then, when Blake had finished, he slid a thick file across the table. "This," he said, "is a compilation of every complaint filed against you in the last 5 years. Unlawful searches. Excessive stops. Patterns of profiling. And every time, it was dismissed as a misunderstanding." Blake's jaw tightened. Jordan leaned in slightly. "But when you stopped me, Officer Blake, you weren't just stopping another civilian. You were stopping the man who investigates misconduct in this department. And you didn't even realize it." Blake swallowed hard. The hearing resulted in his suspension, a first for the officer, who had grown accustomed to walking away unscathed. But Jordan knew the real victory wasn't punishing Blake, it was preventing the next Blake. Community meeting, a call for change. Months later, Jordan stood at a podium in a packed community center, addressing a room filled with officers, city officials, and local residents. The incident with Blake had sparked something bigger, a movement, a push for accountability that the department could no longer ignore. "We can't just talk about change," Jordan said, his voice steady and firm. "We have to be the change. We have to hold ourselves to the standards we expect from those we serve. And that means accountability at every level." The crowd was silent, hanging on to his words. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," he continued. "It's about ensuring that the people sworn to protect and serve do so with fairness, integrity, and respect. That badge you wear, it doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." Thunderous applause filled the room. But Jordan didn't linger on it. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. As he stepped down from the podium, his eyes scanned the room, seeing a mixture of reactions. Some were skeptical. Some were hopeful. But all of them were listening. Change wouldn't come overnight. But it would come. And for now, that was enough. The applause had faded, but the weight of Jordan Mitchell's words lingered in the air. As the crowd slowly dispersed from the community center, murmurs of conversation rippled through the room, some voices filled with optimism, others laced with skepticism. Jordan knew that change wouldn't be easy. The Chicago Police Department had been operating under a culture of silence and self-preservation for decades. Shifting that foundation would take time, and resistance was inevitable. But he wasn't here for small victories, he was here for a reckoning. Back at his office the next morning, stacks of case files cluttered his desk, each one detailing past misconduct that had been swept under the rug. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his mind already calculating the next steps. Nathan Blake's suspension had been a start, but Jordan knew that addressing one officer wouldn't fix a system that had been broken for years. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Linda Carter stepped in, her face lined with concern. "You've got visitors," she said. "Who?" Jordan asked, though he had a sinking suspicion. Linda hesitated. "A group of officers. Union reps, they aren't happy." Jordan exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "Send them in." Within moments, the door swung open, and 3 officers in plain clothes entered. Leading the group was Sergeant Adam Reynolds, a 15-year veteran of the force with a stocky build and sharp, calculating eyes. He wasn't known for diplomacy. He was known for protecting his own. "Mr. Mitchell," Reynolds said, crossing his arms. "I think we need to have a conversation." Jordan gestured toward the chairs across from his desk. "Take a seat." Reynolds and his men remained standing. A silent message. Jordan sighed. "All right. What's on your mind, Sergeant?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. "You're shaking the department. Officers are on edge. People feel like they're being targeted." Jordan didn't blink. Targeted? Or held accountable? A muscle twitched in Reynolds' cheek. Blake was a good cop. He made a mistake, and now he's the department's scapegoat. Jordan folded his hands. Blake's actions weren't a mistake. They were a pattern. A pattern that's been ignored for too long. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice low. "Let me tell you how this plays out, Mitchell. You keep pushing, and officers stop trusting you. They stop cooperating. You think you can run this department without the men on the ground? Think again." Jordan met his gaze evenly. "And what happens if we keep looking the other way? More Blakes. More officers who treat the badge like a weapon instead of a responsibility." Reynolds didn't respond. He didn't have to. Jordan exhaled and leaned forward. "I'm not here to make enemies, Sergeant. I'm here to make sure the right people are wearing that badge. If that threatens you, maybe you should be asking yourself why." Silence filled the room, heavy and unspoken. Then, without another word, Reynolds turned on his heel and walked out. The other officers followed, their eyes filled with thinly veiled resentment. As the door clicked shut behind them, Linda peeked in. "Well, that went well." Jordan chuckled dryly. "Could have been worse." Linda stepped inside, setting a file on his desk. "The chief wants an update on the misconduct review by Friday." Jordan nodded, already reaching for the file. "I'll have it ready." Over the next several weeks, the department review escalated into a full-scale investigation. Officers were being questioned. Old cases were being reopened. The media had gotten wind of the changes, and suddenly, internal affairs was the center of attention. Jordan became the target of whispered conversations in the hallways. Some officers saw him as a necessary force of change. Others saw him as a traitor. He expected the pushback, but what he hadn't expected was the late-night phone calls, the anonymous threats, the sudden cold shoulders from people he once considered allies. One evening, as Jordan was leaving the office, He noticed a familiar figure waiting outside the station, Nathan Blake. Blake's suspension had been indefinite, and judging by the tension in his posture, he was here for a confrontation. "Got a minute?" Blake asked, his voice strained but controlled. Jordan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Walk with me." They strode down the quiet street, the streetlights casting long shadows. "You really did it," Blake muttered, stuffing his hands in his jacket pockets. "You made an example out of me." Jordan exhaled. "I didn't make an example out of you, Blake. You did that yourself." Blake scoffed. "You think you fixed anything? The guys in that building, they're just getting angrier. You put me under the microscope, but I'm not the only one." "I know," Jordan said. Blake glanced at him. "Then what's your endgame here?" Jordan stopped walking, turning to face him. "The endgame is a department where the badge stands for integrity, not intimidation. A place where officers are respected because they uphold justice, not because people fear them." Blake looked away, shaking his head. "You're gonna get yourself burned out, Mitchell. Or worse." Jordan's expression didn't waver. "Maybe. But at least I'll know I stood for something." Blake said nothing. He just nodded, shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, and walked off into the night. Jordan knew he had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. The department was divided. The community was watching. The mayor's office had begun pressuring the chief to speed up the review process, and rumors of high-profile dismissals spread like wildfire. Then, one evening, an explosion rocked everything. Not a literal explosion. A scandal. A leaked whistleblower report surfaced in the media, detailing cover-ups, hidden complaints, and evidence of corruption at the highest levels. It implicated several ranking officers, including Chief Parker himself. The city erupted in outrage. Protests flooded the streets. The Department of Justice announced a federal inquiry into the Chicago PD's practices. And Jordan Mitchell? He was at the eye of the storm. A week later, Chief Parker resigned under pressure. Several officers were put on administrative leave pending further investigation. And Jordan, once seen as a thorn in the department's side, was suddenly the man everyone was looking to for answers. At a press conference, a reporter asked, "Mr. Mitchell, what do you say to the officers who claim your investigation has created division?" Jordan's response was firm. "I'd say accountability doesn't divide, it heals. If we can't hold ourselves to the standards we expect of others, then we have no business wearing the badge." The words echoed across the city. And as Jordan stepped away from the cameras, he knew that this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over. But he was more than ready for what came next. Jordan Mitchell sat in his dimly lit office, the soft hum of the city beyond his window a stark contrast to the firestorm he had ignited within the Chicago Police Department. The chair beneath him felt heavier than usual, burdened with the weight of decisions that had shaken the foundation of an institution long accustomed to silence. He had expected resistance, had braced for retaliation, but even he hadn't anticipated how deep the rot went. The scandal had ripped through the department like wildfire, exposing names that had once commanded unquestioned authority. The federal inquiry was now in full swing, and high-ranking officers were either scrambling for cover or falling like dominoes. Corruption that had festered for decades was finally dragged into the light, and the people of Chicago were watching. Waiting. Demanding more. The knock at his door was soft but deliberate. Linda Carter entered, her face unreadable. "Nathan Blake is here," she said. "He wants to see you." Jordan arched an eyebrow. That was unexpected. "Send him in," he said, leaning back. The door opened, and there he was, Blake, but not the man Jordan had faced on that cold street months ago. The once arrogant officer now looked deflated. Gone was the smug confidence, the self-righteousness. His shoulders sagged slightly, and there was something in his eyes that Jordan had never seen before, uncertainty. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Blake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," he admitted. "But I had to come." Jordan gestured to the chair across from him. "Then sit." Blake hesitated before lowering himself into the seat. He exhaled slowly, as if he were gathering the courage to speak words that had been stuck in his throat for far too long. "I've had a lot of time to think," he started, voice quieter than Jordan had ever heard it. "About that night. About everything you said." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "And the worst part? You were right. About all of it." Jordan remained silent, watching him. Blake shook his head, eyes dark with something between regret and anger, though this time, the anger wasn't directed outward. It was inward. At himself. "I spent years thinking I was one of the good ones," he admitted. "That I was just doing my job, keeping the streets safe. But I wasn't. I was," he exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "I was exactly what people feared. And I didn't even see it." Jordan leaned forward, his voice low but unwavering. "And what do you see now?" Blake met his gaze, and there it was, the moment of reckoning. "I see that I was part of the problem," he said. "And I want to change that." The words hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Jordan studied him, searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was a man standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, accountability. "Change doesn't come from words, Blake," Jordan said finally. "It comes from action." Blake nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here. If there's any way I can help," he hesitated, as if unsure how to phrase the request. "I want to be part of fixing this. I don't know how, but I need to try." Jordan didn't answer right away. Trust wasn't rebuilt in a single conversation, and redemption wasn't granted, it was earned. But something in him knew that what Blake was saying wasn't just empty regret. It was something deeper. "You want to fix this?" Jordan asked. "Then start by listening. Learning. Owning what you did. If you can do that, maybe, there's a place for you in this fight." Blake swallowed hard, nodding. Before he left, he paused at the door, glancing back at Jordan. "This fight you started, you really think it's winnable?" Jordan smirked faintly. "If I didn't, I wouldn't still be standing." Blake held his gaze for a moment, then left. The battle was far from over. And Jordan knew the next chapter would be even harder. Because tearing down a broken system was one thing. Building something better. That was where the real war began. Lessons from Jordan Mitchell's fight for justice, applying it to my life. The story of Jordan Mitchell's fight against corruption and systemic injustice resonates deeply with me, not just as a powerful narrative but as a reflection of the challenges we face in our own lives and society. While I am not an internal affairs officer exposing police misconduct, the core lessons from Jordan's journey, standing for what's right, holding people accountable, and pushing for change despite resistance, apply to many aspects of life, including my own. Whether it's navigating professional integrity, advocating for justice in personal relationships, or simply having the courage to challenge wrongdoing, Jordan's experience offers wisdom that can be used in real-world situations. One of the biggest takeaways from Jordan's story is the power of persistence in the face of opposition. He didn't just expose one corrupt officer, he uncovered a deeply rooted culture of misconduct. That mirrors real life, where problems are rarely isolated, they are usually symptoms of larger, systemic issues. In my own life, I can apply this lesson by understanding that when I see injustice, whether in the workplace, within a community, or even in personal interactions, it's not enough to just point it out once and walk away. Change requires continuous effort. It means being willing to take uncomfortable stands, even when others push back. If Jordan had stopped after suspending one officer, the deeper corruption in the department would have remained untouched. The same goes for real-life problems. They don't disappear unless we address them at the root. Another key lesson from Jordan's experience is the importance of self-reflection and accountability. A character like Nathan Blake, an officer who believed he was one of the good ones until confronted with his own failures, is a reminder that we all have blind spots. It's easy to assume we are always in the right, but real growth happens when we question our own actions and biases. In my life, this means being open to constructive criticism, recognizing my flaws, and being willing to change when I realize I've been wrong. Many times, pride and ego keep people from seeing the truth, but Blake's transformation shows that real change begins with self-awareness. If I want to grow as a person, I have to be willing to face hard truths about myself, whether that's in how I treat others, how I handle responsibility, or how I contribute to problems instead of solving them. The story also highlights the need for courage when facing opposition. Jordan faced threats, hostility from fellow officers, and pressure from higher-ups to stay quiet. But he never backed down. This is a reminder that in real life, doing the right thing is rarely easy. People will resist change, especially when that change exposes their own wrongdoing. If I ever find myself in a situation where I need to call out injustice, unethical behavior, or mistreatment, I must prepare for backlash. But, like Jordan, I have to remain steady, knowing that real change never comes from silence. Lastly, Jordan's story teaches the balance between idealism and realism. He wasn't naive, he knew the police department wouldn't magically transform overnight. But he also didn't let that discourage him from taking action. He understood that progress happens step by step. In my own life, this reminds me that I don't need to fix everything all at once. Whether it's tackling personal goals, advocating for change, or making a difference in my community, I have to focus on what's within my power today while keeping my long-term vision intact. Small steps lead to bigger shifts. The world needs more people like Jordan Mitchell, people who refuse to look the other way when they see something wrong. And if I want to live with integrity, I need to be one of them.